of your assignment submissions. Congratulations on the fantastic marks. I'm very impressed. We will obviously be moving on to assignment 2 now. So I have taken a quick look at the assignment. So I want to just focus in on a couple of things that will be useful to you before I move on to the next section of our work, which would be Learning Unit 5. So just to completely close off Learning Unit 4, which we covered last week, I just wanted to reiterate these definitions. Okay, so of course, you know that an absolute advantage is when a country can produce a good or service at a lower cost per unit than any other entity. Okay, so that means that in here, when we look at our example, okay, so here we have our example where Germany can either produce 2 cars or 8 barrels of wine. In South Africa, using the same equipment or our productive capacity, we can produce 1 car or 6 barrels of wine. Okay, so as you can see here, very obviously, it's Germany that has the absolute advantage in both cars and wine. Okay, what does that mean? They can produce at a lower cost per unit than anyone else. And in this example, there are only 2 countries. Now, on the other hand, a comparative or a relative advantage means that even though we are producing the same goods, we can still have beneficial trade between us by specializing. So 2 countries benefit from trade in a specific goods with one another if the opportunity cost of production is different. Now, what I want you to remember is that we will specialize, the person or the country will always specialize where their opportunity costs are the lowest. Okay, so here we have our example again. We're going to take it one step further. Okay, so we've established that Germany obviously is far more productive. They can produce a lot more than we can with the same production capacity. But when you are looking at, so absolute advantage is pretty easy to establish. I mean, you can sort of look at it and see, okay, well, obviously one country is either very good at producing one product or both products, like in this case, okay? But when you're looking at relative advantage, you have to do some calculations. You're going to have to like bring it down to what 1 car will cost per barrel. So you want to answer these questions. In which country does it cost less to produce a car in terms of wine? Okay, so I want you to think as though we're in a bartering system. Okay, so that means that in Germany, we know that 2 cars is equal to 8 barrels of wine. Okay, they're choosing between the 2. So that means that 1 car costs them 4 barrels of wine. Okay, and 1 barrel of wine costs them a quarter of a car. Now, in fact, let me provide you with an alternate example. Okay, so what you can see here is that, okay, then of course on the South African side, we also have to count what does that 1 car cost in barrels of wine? And we want to know what does 1 barrel of wine cost in terms of cars? Okay, so those are the 2 questions you're going to be asking yourself whenever you get given a relative advantage question. So what you're going to end up having is something that looks a little bit like what is a table. Let me just actually show you that. I worked out a similar example here. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to look at the opportunity cost of one vehicle, 1 ton of wine. Okay, what does it cost you in terms of the other product? What is the opportunity cost? Okay, this is where the PPC from Macroeconomics comes into play again. If you guys don't remember that, that's chapter 1 in your textbook. Okay, just a quick squiz and you'll remember what this means. The reason I wanted to show you this example is because what you're trying to populate is this kind of table, okay, where you're looking at the vehicles or the wine. Okay, so now how many vehicles does it cost South Africa to produce these 2 tons of wine? Okay, so it's one vehicle, 2 tons of wine. In Germany, you're looking at one vehicle costing them 6 tons of wine. Okay, so obviously, if you're looking at just this product, you can see that South Africa has the lower comparative cost. Okay, so we have an advantage there. It only costs us to produce one vehicle, only costs us 2 tons of wine or 2 caskets of wine. But for Germany, they have the opposite. They have their comparative advantage in vehicles. Why? Because one um I don't know what you would call it. One casket of wine? No, one barrel of wine, of course. Goodness, forgive me. Okay, so one barrel of wine is going to cost them half a vehicle. It's going to cost us half a vehicle. But it only costs Germany 0.667 vehicles. So what I want you to remember is that the country will specialize in the product where they have the lowest comparative advantage. Okay, so this means that Germany produces vehicles and South Africa produces wine. Okay, so you're not interested in who produces most efficiently when you're looking at comparative advantage. You are only concerned with the lowest numbers. Once you tabulate your numbers or work out what each specific product is worth in terms of the other product, and you've done that for all 4 scenarios, you are only concerned with the lowest values you see. Okay. And that, whatever that is, will be what that country will specialize in. Okay. So if we're jumping back to this example, you'll see here that it was quite clear that Germany, it costs them 4 barrels of wine to produce one car. In South Africa, it costs us 6 barrels of wine. So our opportunity cost is much lower for each car because we are obviously more productive in producing wine. So we end up producing the wine. And because each car costs Germany only 4 barrels of wine, they'd rather import it from us. Okay. Okay, so essentially that's how we get countries to specialize in specific products. Okay, then there was the other thing that I wanted to look at before we move on. Okay, so this is still part of Learning Unit 4. Just a couple of things I wanted to highlight. We did look at these in various levels of we have looked at these learning units in various levels of detail. If you guys have any questions, please let me know. Okay, and then so here when we look at the exchange rate, okay, this is obviously going to be quite important as well. And we're going to look at what happens in terms of dollar supply. Now, of course, because the dollar is the reserve currency of the world, it is the one that everybody pegs against. So that is the most important peg that we are concerned with. Why? Because obviously we import our oil. A lot of countries import oil, even if it's just to make up the difference. And in that case, we obviously do need dollars in order to succumb to the petrodollar. Okay, so here I want to look at, okay, so here is a perfect example of what happens if there is an increase in the demand for rands. Okay, so now what you'll note is this is still a demand and supply graph. Okay, exactly like you've looked at before. you've got the only difference is instead of price, you've got rand per dollar. Okay, so this is showing you this is the exchange rate. So now what would move this exchange rate? Okay, so now if there is, for example, a lot of demand for South African exports, that would mean that a lot of people who want to perhaps buy our gold would need to purchase it in rands. That means they have to buy the rands before they can buy the gold. Now that demand for South African rands would also increase our demand. Now, in the sorry, this is the correct graph. Okay, so in the specific example, we do want to look at what happens if there is an increase, for example. Okay, so um, let's look at we have an increase in exports, so we receive a lot of dollars into our country, okay, because they need the rands in order to purchase um, products from us. So that means that they supply us dollars in exchange. That means that we have a supply chain shift to the right in our dollar rand exchange rate. Okay, so where we see this shift in the curve, what it means is when we hold more dollars, it appreciates the value of the local currency. So our rand is actually appreciating here. So whenever we get stronger versus the dollar, which means that we require fewer rands to purchase dollars, that means that our rand is appreciating versus the dollar. So you'll see here if there is an increase in the demand for our products, what will happen is that we will have an influx of dollars into our currency. That shifts our supply chain to the right, which appreciates our currency. I know it looks a bit confusing here because you'll see that this right shift in your supply curve is actually bringing down your price, but it's a good thing for us, especially because a stronger currency makes imports cheaper. Of course, we looked at that when we were looking at the cost of a tractor at different exchange rates with the dollar. Okay, then was that all I wanted to cover? Okay, and then just to be sure, okay, appreciation, of course, is the increase in the value of your currency versus another currency. Depreciation is the value of your currency decreasing. Things that cause that are obviously issues if you become too indebted, like what happened in Greece in 2015. That caused a lot of depreciation in their currency. Why? Because people didn't want to hold a currency that was dropping in value. It was dropping in value because the government and the industries that were supporting the currency were failing. Yeah. Okay, I think. Okay, then a few other things as well. Not so pertinent. Okay, oh, there we go. Um, So in your textbook, you will see that you have these summary tables. They are the most valuable pages in your textbook. Okay, why? Because they summarize different changes that can be used in case studies in your tests, your assignments, or your exams. So it is important to understand these different variables. So if there is a supply of dollar increase, what will happen to the supply curve? What happens to the demand curve? Guys, please understand that you are only most likely going to be shifting one curve at a time. Okay, so don't escalate too far. So think one step ahead. Okay, so if there is an increase in the demand for gold, a lot of people need to buy our currency, that means they are simply flooding our country with their currency in order to get our rands. Okay, now because there is an influx of another currency, we will strengthen against them. Okay, so that's just important to bear in mind. If you have any questions relating to that, please let me know. I know this can get a bit confusing. Okay, so the reason that we also have to just bear in mind that there are different types of exchange rates. So there is a managed floating exchange rate. They are managed and somewhat manipulated by central banks. So in order to make sure that the rand doesn't spike from 13 to 20 in the space of 3 days, we have a central bank which acts on our behalf. So if our currency depreciates beyond a certain threshold, so say it goes beyond 2% in a day, they will start to sell rands. Okay, so if it appreciates too much, they sell rands so that we can hold more foreign assets, which means our currency will, sort of strengthen, but not, we can strategically sell the currencies where we need to sort of strengthen and allow ourselves to prevent any massive volatility by having one exchange rate just jump out of control. That can happen in a free floating exchange rate. So that is very subject to speculation. Now, free floating exchange rates don't happen very often. So that's exactly the problem with Bitcoin as well, is that it's very free floating. It is entirely determined by demand and supply. So exchange rates are managed. If we depreciate too much, the government will again step in and they'll start buying up the rands to make it look like the demand is increasing, therefore pushing the price back up. So we have a lot of interactions like that. Okay, so that's when you'll start to see, as soon as the government is intervening, that is when you'll see both demand and supplies shifting. Okay. Now, foreign exchange is probably the largest market in the world. The second largest would, of course, be bonds. Okay, the bond market is the second largest, and the third is, of course, equities. Okay, so this is how far we have come. We have now just finished off the foreign sector. If you guys have any questions there, please let me know. We can definitely do a little bit more detail, and I will give you a full assignment lecture closer to your submission. But just so that you have enough information, as always, to go through the work when when life avails some time to you. Okay, so how do we measure our economy? So very important to understand how your economy is going to react, whether we are strong, whether we are weak. Remember that foreign exchange offers us something very interesting in that every currency is only as strong as another currency. So everything is relative to every other currency. So it's very hard to sort of determine if you look at sort of world exchange rates, who is, sort of how does that quite match up with how the economy is doing? So if you really want to understand if your economy, your country is growing or shrinking or heading for a depression, we need to understand how to measure our economy without foreign relativeness. Okay, so for learning unit 5, we need to cover these specific learning objectives. Okay, I encourage you, most of them are pretty simple. I'm going to sort of fly through them quite quickly. Where I think you might struggle a little bit. Okay, so it does involve quite a few formulae. Okay, the essay questions, probably reserved for the exam, will be things like your macroeconomic objectives and defining GDP. which is actually more involved than you think. And then when you're looking at the difference between nominal GDP and other national accounting concepts, that's a lot of calculations and a lot of formulae. Now, I understand that there's, even in the exam, we do give you guys a formula sheet, and I will provide you a version of that as well going forward from here, because this is where your calculations are going to start making an impact. Okay, then we're going to look at consumer price index, which is, of course, a measure of your inflation, which ties again into one of our 5 macroeconomic objectives, and then how we link through the rest of the world. So, like I said, your economy is one thing, and then you have your foreign exchange and how your currency is behaving or valued versus other currencies. So, what we do in order to establish our trade balance is we have a system of accounts called the balance of payments. And we'll go into that in a little bit of depth because it's essentially accounting at a country level, which is quite exciting, really. So you're looking at all of your exports and imports being accounted for, all the money that leaves your country, all services rendered. We're going to look at all of that. Okay, so very quickly, your 5 macroeconomic objectives is simply economic growth, full employment, price stability, balance of payment stability, and equitable distribution of income. Now, of course, those are all 5 very important and critical objectives of a government and every macroeconomic system. But it's important to understand how to balance these objectives too. Okay, so economic growth is of course necessary because we need to expand our PPC. Full employment, if we are not fully employed, that means that our PPC is inefficient. Price stability, we can't have our people with inflation that is out of control. Balance of payment stability, that again plays into how we manage our foreign exchange and our currency. And then equitable distribution of income speaks very much to how we tax our people, how we redistribute income throughout our country. Okay, so each of them, of course, has these very detailed very detailed explanations, but I won't go too much into that because time is short. So full employment is something that is very rarely achieved. First world countries achieve single-digit unemployment numbers. Obviously, in South Africa, that's not something we um, reasonably can hope for in the near future. Price stability, that is something that we do have. And of course, you guys will later learn about something called the Phillips curve, which shows you how these macroeconomic objectives can sometimes conflict with one another. For example, if you have full employment, according to the Phillips curve, that means that you will have very high inflation. Why? Because everyone who's earning an income is now competing for the same goods and services. So you have to have a reasonable amount of unemployment in order to not have terrible inflation. Then, of course, we have the SARB. Like I said, it is the Reserve Bank that does the accounting for the country. So everything we buy, sell, cross-border is accounted for in this system of accounts. And then we said equitable distribution of income. This is a tricky one because it's very subjective. So it is very much based on our social welfare and our taxes and how our budget is established. Now, when we look at our economy as a whole, we have to consider the different ways of measuring the economy. Obviously, you guys can understand that it is difficult to measure one person's productivity, let alone 60 million. Okay, or the 20 million who are employed. Okay, so the first step is to determine our full production for a specific period. Okay, so remember, this is also a flow. Why? Because we measure it over the period of a year. What do we produce this year? It has to be performed in the national accounting section. So it's Stats SA that provides the information to the South African Reserve Bank, and they act as the bookkeepers of the country. But all the information is provided by Stats SA. So GDP is about our national account. So it's how do we measure the economic activity of everybody in our country? There's also an underlying reliance on the double entry ecosystem that you guys will have covered in accounting. Okay, so here is your pure definition of GDP. Please consider that all of these small terms and phrases have very important significance. Okay, so gross implies that we do not make any allowance for depreciation. Okay, so even if you have employed 100 million rands worth of equipment and you're depreciating at a 10% a year, it will not be included. Because, of course, many companies use depreciation as a way to write down their profits. Okay, so we can't allow a country to do that and then accurately be able to look at the country in isolation as well as relative to other countries. So we have to have an accounting standard that speaks across international borders. So you've got the gross domestic product, which is the total value, which means that, okay, we'll look at that value in more detail, but it is only the final goods and services produced, okay? So not the flour that was used to produce the bread, only the value of the bread, but all the bread that was produced within the boundaries of our country in a particular year. Okay, now the boundaries of our country is also very important because you'll see that as we go on to different types of national accounts, that we consider different things like people living outside the country, sending money into the country, all of these different variables. So let's look at each of these. Okay, so we need to determine the value of the goods of our economy. What have we produced? Now, there are a few different ways that we can do that. Okay, let me just. So we use the prices. Why? Because the prices at the store is your final goods, and it's a great way to determine the value of production. So if we look at the value of the production of each participant in the process, then we are calculating GDP using production. So we're saying, okay, so the farmer um, picked the grain, okay, or produced the grain, then sold it to be processed into flour, then it was further sold into bread. If we look at what each participant in that supply chain contributed to the value of the product, then we have a measure of gross value added. Okay, the problem is it is sometimes difficult to distinguish between final and intermediate goods if you're using that process because obviously the grain is going into the flour, it is the main component. So the value that is added can be difficult to calculate. So you have to only consider the income that is earned by the factors of production. So we are only looking at not not the grain that is going into the flour, but what did we pay to turn that grain into flour? How much did we pay for the mill, the capital, the entrepreneurship, the labor? That is what we calculate when we're calculating GVA. Okay, it is still the total value of all the goods and services, but it is not using final goods. It is looking at everyone's contribution. The problem with that is that often the biggest problem we encountered with GDP calculations is double counting. Because, of course, if you're using intermediate goods, there's a good chance that we could count the grain in the value of the flour and then again in the value of the bread, which means that we are counting more than once. Okay, so in our example here, a farmer produces 1,000 bags of wheat. He sells it to the miller for 10 Rand a bag. So he's got 10,000 Rand. The miller then processes that wheat into flour, sells it to the baker for 12,500 Rand. Now, after baking the bread with that same flour, the baker sells it to the shop for 18,000. And the bread is finally sold to consumers for 21,000. So the totals of each sale are 61,500. But if we were to add them up, would we get GDP? No, we've double counted. We needed to look at only the amount of value that each firm's products exceeds the value of the goods and services that it purchased at the previous stage. Okay, so that is what we call the production method. Then we have the expenditure method. Now, I understand that this can get a bit overwhelming, so feel free to just take a break here. But it's important that you just note down all of these formulae and get quite comfortable using them because they very often pop up in the exam as well. Okay, so the expenditure method means that you are only looking at what consumers spend on the final goods and services. Obviously, the easiest one to calculate. Then we have the income method. Okay, so the production method, sorry, the income method, okay, is where we use the income of the factors of production. So here we have the production method, and that's where we use basic prices. So we are only looking at the contributions of each industry to GDP. For expenditure, of course, we are only using market prices because we only look at final goods and services. And then, of course, for the income method, we're only going to look at what the households receive for their factors of production, what remuneration, and that's how we calculate GDP versus based on income. Okay, so the actual value that was added to our previous example was only 21,000. Why? The original value is the never changes. So it's only the difference, what has been added at each stage of the supply chain that gets calculated for value add. Okay, so when we're looking at these types of processes, we're looking at only what each industry is adding. And that's how we get a GDP of 21,000 Rand using the production method. Now, here's an opportunity for you to try. You'll note that only the difference between that 28,500 and 25,000 is added using the value added method. So we're only looking at the difference. The next difference is 6,200. Do you know the next one? 4,200. Very good. Now, if we add it up, we can see that our GDP's accurate reflection is actually 38,900. But if we had just simply added up the value of the sales using intermediate products as well, we would have encountered 4 times the value due to double counting. Okay, now the expenditure method, here's where our bigger formulas start to come in. Okay, so of course, you guys remember from our first lot of sessions that GDP or your economy is based on how much your consumers spend, how much your firms invest, how much government spending there is, and your net exports. And finally, we use the income method. Okay, so this is where we disregard the product entirely and we look at only what was earned by each person within the production phase. And you'll see, again, we get 21,000. The same outcome we got when we were using basic prices. So why do we use three different methods to get the same value? Well, it's very important that you understand that production and income are two sides of the same coin, because production is the source of income. If we don't produce, there is no income. Income earned by factors of production are always going to be included in production, so they are interweaved with one another. And because of the circular flow, we expect each of these different values to yield the same value. Now, like I said, there are many different ways, in fact, three different ways to calculate our GDP, but you might not always get the same values to work with. Okay, so you need to be able to say if you are given GDP at market prices, you need to be able to know what needs to be removed or added in order to calculate GDP at basic prices. Okay, if you're getting a bit confused about those terms, the expenditure method is also GDP calculated at market prices, production method is basic prices, and then of course, income is based on your factor costs. Okay, so you can see here that there are many different ways to connect these different. Okay, so final goods and services is obviously going to be related to the expenditure method. Why? We're only looking at what the consumer spends. Then you're looking at, so it's expenditure on the GDP at market prices. If you're looking at incomes, of course, we're looking at the income method. Why? Because we have to look at what did we pay to get those people to produce those products. Okay, so we look at the factor cost. Why? Because income is the largest contributor to factor costs. And then we've got value added, which is, of course, the production method, and it is linked to your gross value added at basic prices. So what was added at each level by each industry throughout the supply chain of that product. Okay, please feel free to watch the video when you guys have a moment. Okay, and then I want to move on. Okay, so just to reiterate, okay, so you guys remember our 5 macroeconomic objectives: economic growth, price stability, full employment, balance of payments, and, oh, sorry, equity, of course. Goodness, forgive me. Okay, you know how to define your GDP, which is the gross value, total value of all final finished goods that are produced within the boundaries of our economy within the period of a year. Okay, so now we're going to move on to looking at things that are very important in South Africa, which is explaining the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP, as well as unemployment and employment. Okay, so just a bit of a reminder. I have reiterated that, of course, you guys do need to be able to adjust. Whichever GDP figure they give you, you need to be able to change it by adding and subtracting taxes or subsidies in order to get the other costs. Now, how to remember what needs to be added and subtracted? Well, I've given you a simple diagram here. If you are provided with GDP at factor costs, you want to add production taxes and you want to take off any subsidies. If you're moving from basic prices to market prices, you want to add in those taxes and take off the subsidies. Remember, we're trying to get an accurate reflection of how much our country has produced within the period of a year. So at factor costs, we are looking at the income of the people who have contributed to adding value to our product. So we need to add those taxes in because it contributed to the basic price of that product. But subsidies, that needs to be taken away because that has reduced the factor costs artificially. So when you get to basic prices, you need to move, obviously, that is only looking at the product itself. So when you move to market prices, you've got to take off any subsidies, which again have contributed specifically to the product. Okay, so whenever you see production, it's going to be factor related. Whenever you see product or basic prices, it'll be product related. And of course, it works in exactly the inverse. Now, as we just said, there are production taxes, which are paid on actual production, independent of the volume. And then there's product taxes, which is very dependent on the volume, and you're paying it per unit of product. Then there's a different production subsidies and there are product subsidies. Now, production subsidies help a farmer to survive, okay, or to become more competitive in his industry by reducing his per unit cost of production. A product subsidy, that is very dependent on the volume of the product. That is where we subsidize a specific product, for example, because it is necessary for the population. So, for example, if we're looking at bread in basic prices, by the time we look at the market price, we have to consider that government does subsidize bread because it's a basic product, that basic product for sustenance within our population. So here you can test yourself again. Okay, so this is a very good example of the type of question you'll get. You get GDP at market prices and you get asked to convert it to GDP at basic prices. Okay, so all you have to do is take your original value and then you're going to subtract your taxes on products and add your subsidies on those products to figure out what the actual contribution was. You will see here again the difference between taxes on production and taxes on products, taxes on subsidies, and taxes on subsidies for production and subsidies for products. If you are moving from basic prices to market prices, you will only be focusing on the products aspect because as we looked at in this diagram, anything that is a conversion between basic and market or market to basic will only be product related, and anything moving from basic to factor will only be production related. Okay, so here we have the value of our GDP at basic prices. Of course, you can see from market prices to factor costs. Here we have to have less indirect taxes. Okay, so that includes things like VAT. Okay, then we have subsidies. Any subsidies have to also be added because remember, we are now jumping back 2 stages. Okay, so we are now adding some of the one and some of the other. Then you have constant and current prices, which is essentially the difference between a nominal GDP and a real GDP. Okay, so at current prices, what we're looking at is GDP we've got GDP using today's prices. That means that the size of our GDP is based on the ruling prices of the day. but real GDP shows you, it gives you something outside things that can change on a daily basis. So the problem with current prices is that it's, for example, if you get told that your salary is 10,000 Rand, that is your nominal salary. Okay, that is what you get. But then you've got your real salary, your real GDP. Okay, so you've got the size of your income. But when you look at the inflation rate, so say you get the following year, just for example, you get a 10% increase on your income, but inflation goes up 4%. That means that despite the fact that you're now bringing home 11,000 Rand, because inflation went up, that extra 1,000 Rand that you're getting isn't based on current prices. Yes, you've gotten a nominal increase, but based on constant prices. In other words, based on what has happened in the market. So if we give it a base year, if you look at that 11,000 Rand based on the previous year's prices, then you're actually only getting an additional 600 Rand in value. So the base year aims to eliminate the effects of inflation across a period. So your nominal value will always be the face value, but your real value is your actual purchasing power. It's very consequential. So a graduate could get paid in 1992 a starting salary of 5,000 Rand. If a graduate this year gets offered a salary of 5,000 Rand, are they being paid the same? Despite the fact that the nominal value is the same, 5,000 Rand in 1992 was enough to buy a house, a car, put 3 kids through university, and pay for the dog and the cat. Okay. But in 2026, 5,000 Rand is fighting poverty. So here you may be asked for the comparison between nominal and real GDP. So I'd ask you just to remember this summary table. Okay, now the tricky part is you might actually be asked to calculate these differences. So you actually have to calculate what your GDP is going to be. Now in this scenario, they have given you an example where you have to calculate the nominal GDP for 2028, oh sorry, for 2018, and then calculate the increase in real GDP for 2018. Okay, so here we can see our nominal GDP. Okay, sorry. Let's look at what we actually gained. Okay, now the difference between our nominal GDP from 2010 and our nominal GDP from 2018 is the difference between our production capacity and the increase in price. So what we do here to establish how has our production capacity actually increased? If we looked at just the total number of apples, it looks like we've increased our production of apples in 8 years by 300%. We've gone from 50 Rand to 150 Rand. But half of that, at least, could be contributed purely based on price, not us increasing production capacity, which you can see has also gone up, but only by 30%. So here we look at what does real GDP look like in 2018? And to do that, we look at what the actual production was of this year, which is 2018. Then we look at the prices from way back in 2010. And we see, has our economy actually grown from 2010 to 2018? Because we are using a base year of 2010. And we can see, yes, we have in fact grown, but we haven't grown quite as much as we thought we did. Here we do exactly the same thing with our bananas. Our production capacity has not increased at all. We're still producing 200 bananas 8 years later, but the price has gone up by 15 cents from 25 to 40 cents. So now if we look at the prices we paid all the way back in 2010, if we take those 200 bananas and we put them at 25 cents, 2010's pricing, we see that our economy has not grown. It's in fact stayed exactly the same with regards to bananas. The only thing that's gone up is the price. Now, if we look at oranges, you can see how this has real life, real world implications for how you manage your own budgets. Okay, so also to understand, because this is a nominal figures are a rising tide, they're all relative to one another. If you are making 100,000 rand in in a month, is that a lot of money or a little bit of money? It's a nominal amount that you could compare with other nominal amounts. But if you've got, say, a 50,000 rand house that you pay off every month, a 20,000 rand car, and maybe another 50,000 rand in debt repayments, your real increase or your real state of living is not what 100,000 rand would look like to most people, perhaps, because you could still be living with the stress. So there is a real quality to looking at things using with prices not being included. Like, what has really increased? Was it your production? Was it your quality of life in that scenario? Or was it your production capacity? Or was it simply inflation? Okay, so now we look at our final example, which is oranges. Here we see that our production is actually decreased here, but it still looks like, if we look at just the nominal GDP, like our industry in oranges has grown by 5 rand. But let's look if it still holds up when we look at the real figures. So at our current production capacity of 100 oranges, but using 2010's prices at 30 cents, how much is this industry now currently worth? 30 rand. We've actually had a depression of this entire industry because they've contracted by 15 rand, by 30%. So now all we have to do is calculate by adding all of these values together, and we'll have the real GDP for 2018. Now, when we are looking at did our real GDP increase or decrease, we'd take our nominal GDP, the total here from 2018. This is just rate of change again, okay? Because of course, how quickly did your national production capacity increase is very important as well. So we look simply at what did we do in 2018? What did we do in the past? And we put it over what we had in the past to see how fast we've grown. And we've grown by 95%, 93% based on nominal GDP. But when we look at real GDP, we can see that here we're looking at 155 versus 145. And the difference between that is obviously much smaller than the difference between our nominal GDPs. And this gives us an accurate reflection of how our economic growth has actually gone. And it's much closer to 6.9% rather than saying that we've actually grown 93% in the last 8 years. Okay, so I've also provided you with an example that you guys can do in your own time. Okay, it will reveal answers to you one at a time so you can really just gauge what level of understanding you're at, and then you can ask me any questions if you just need any help getting over the hurdle. Okay, so obviously GDP is a flow. Why? Because we don't measure it at one period of time, we measure it over the period of a year. What is the definition of GDP? We also have that sewn up. Okay, so it's the total value of all the goods and services final goods and services we produce within the boundaries of our country for a particular year. Now, It's also important to remember that in the same way that we have GDP at market prices, basic prices, and factor prices, we also calculate different versions of GDP or different measures of production and income. Okay, so if you'll remember our circular flow, you know that there are three flows in our economy. We have production, income, and expenses. You also would note that we either have a gross domestic or we have a gross national. Okay, so here are other measures of production, of measuring production and income. We have the gross national income, the gross domestic expenditure, the gross national production. Okay, now the difference is, okay, because this also gets important because in the same way you will ask to convert different GDP figures, you may be asked to convert GDP to GNI to GDE, etc. Okay, so the difference between gross national income and gross national product. So GDP only considers what we produce within the boundaries of our economy, okay, or our country. That's where the D comes in. That is domestic. Okay. So, but the problem is it doesn't really give an accurate reflection of the standard of living of South Africans. So that's why we instead use our gross national income. Now, the national part, which is replacing the domestic that you're quite comfortable with, means that we are looking at everyone who is a South African citizen living anywhere in the world. So nationally, internationally, you are a national citizen, but not necessarily living here. Okay. And then, of course, looking at income instead of production. So here we're looking at how much do you earn as a participant in that other country for our country. Okay. It, of course, does still equal GN. Sorry, it still does equal gross national product. Okay, so if you are asked to convert GDP to GNI, you need to add the primary income recipients, which means all South Africans earning remuneration in the rest of the world needs to be added. And you need to remove all the remuneration earned by foreigners within our economy. Okay, so what you're trying to say is only what do the citizens earn, not what is produced or what do we pay within the boundaries of our economy, but how much do our citizens earn internationally and nationally. Okay, then when we are looking at expenditure on GDP, of course, we did look at what each of these acronyms or these symbols mean. You've got consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So when we are looking at this specific measure, you're looking at all the expenditure on that is conducted within the boundaries of South Africa. Okay, so you have to remove imports in this scenario. Okay, so this doesn't indicate the total value of the spending within the country. What does is this. Okay, so according to the expenditure approach, um, how does GDP change? Okay, so let's just look at a couple of examples because just in case I would have lost you by this point. Okay, so Coca-Cola SA invests 10 million in a bottling plant. Would you say that is, what would that do to GDP? It would increase investment, therefore it increases GDP. If Bidvest Car Hire expands its fleet, what are they doing? They are, again, investing and therefore going to increase GDP. Do you see how we're progressing here? So anything that increases on this side of the equation would do the same to the other side of the equation for GDP. Any expenditure increases would push up GDP. And I've just gone over time, so I will leave this for the last section. Okay, so what we're going to look at next week is we're just going to focus on employment, unemployment, CPI, and your different trade balances. We've made some great progress today. It is important to just do a quick recap. Make sure that you understand these specific terms before we start progressing. And of course, this is a very important table. Just be sure that you do know how to convert factor cost to basic to market, as well as we will go into our different measures for um, economic activity and how to convert GDP to GNI and GDE, etc. Okay, guys, then if there are no questions, I will stop our recording there. Thank you so much for a lovely